November 1985, a safe house in suburban Virginia. Oleg Gordievsky sat in a comfortable chair across from two CIA officers who had introduced themselves with first names and handshakes. The room was warm, furnished with sofas and tables that belonged in any American middle-class home. Gordievsky's hands weren't bound. No one stood behind him with weapons. The officers were discussing the debriefing schedule, how many hours per day, what topics they needed to cover, whether Gordievsky needed anything to make his stay more comfortable. Gordievsky waited for the act to end. KGB training had been explicit about what happened when Western intelligence captured Soviet agents. The comfortable facade would collapse. The friendly officers would be replaced by interrogators trained in torture techniques. The questions would be accompanied by beatings, drugs, electroshock, sensory deprivation. Soviet intelligence doctrine was clear. Capitalist intelligence services were brutal, sadistic, and would employ any method to extract information from captured agents. Gordievsky had prepared himself psychologically for torture. He had memorized techniques to resist for 72 hours, long enough for Moscow to pull other operatives and change protocols. He carried the memory of the cyanide capsule option, though MI6 had removed it when they extracted him from the Soviet Union. But the torture didn't begin. One officer poured coffee from a pot on the side table. "Would you like cream? Sugar?" The question seemed absurd. Gordievsky accepted the coffee and waited. The other officer opened a notebook. "We know you've had a difficult few months. The KGB interrogation in Moscow, the stress of extraction. We want you to know that you're safe now. Everything we discuss is voluntary. If you need to stop at any time, just say so. Are you comfortable? Do you need anything?" Gordievsky realized with dawning shock that they were serious. This wasn't psychological manipulation designed to lower his defenses before the real interrogation began. This was how American intelligence actually operated. Everything the KGB had taught him about Western brutality was a lie. And that realization, in that moment, in that comfortable Virginia living room with coffee and polite conversation, began the process that would transform Oleg Gordievsky from a rescued defector into one of the most valuable intelligence assets the West ever gained from the Soviet Union. Soviet intelligence training, whether KGB for foreign operations or GRU for military intelligence, included extensive preparation for capture scenarios. Every agent sent abroad or recruited to operate in hostile territory received instruction on what to expect if caught by Western intelligence services. The training was designed to prepare agents psychologically for torture and to provide techniques for resisting interrogation long enough to protect other operatives and ongoing operations. The expectation taught to every Soviet intelligence officer was explicit. Western intelligence used torture. CIA officers were portrayed as sadistic interrogators who employed beatings, electroshock devices, pharmacological drugs that destroyed mental resistance, and sensory deprivation techniques that drove prisoners insane. British MI6 was characterized as equally brutal, with traditions of torture inherited from colonial intelligence operations. The training films shown to KGB officers depicted Western interrogations, where Soviet agents were beaten, drugged, and subjected to physical abuse designed to break their will. These films were fabrications, actors portraying torture scenes that Soviet propaganda claimed represented standard Western practice. But KGB officers didn't know they were watching fiction. The films were presented as actual footage or reconstructions based on debriefs of Soviet agents who had been captured and later released in spy exchanges. The message was reinforced constantly throughout training. If the West captures you, expect brutality. Expect torture. Expect treatment that violates every principle of human rights that Western nations claim to uphold. The psychological preparation that accompanied this training emphasized resistance techniques. Agents were taught to resist for 72 hours, 3 days that would allow Moscow Center to pull other operatives from the field, change communication protocols, and warn agents whose identities might be compromised. After 72 hours, resistance became optional. The assumption was that no human could withstand sophisticated torture indefinitely. Eventually, everyone broke. The goal was to delay that breaking long enough that the intelligence revealed was partially obsolete by the time Western interrogators extracted it. Some agents were provided cyanide capsules concealed in false teeth or jewelry, a suicide option if capture seemed imminent and torture unavoidable. The capsules represented both a practical escape from suffering and a romantic notion of ultimate sacrifice for the Soviet state. KGB training emphasized that choosing death rather than breaking under torture was honorable. Western intelligence would gain nothing from a dead agent. The choice to die rather than betray was portrayed as the highest form of loyalty to the Soviet Union. Oleg Gordievsky's background made his defection particularly devastating to Soviet intelligence. He had joined the KGB in 1963 as a young officer committed to Soviet ideology. His early assignments in Copenhagen during the 1960s and early 1970s had been unremarkable. Standard intelligence work recruiting agents, gathering information on NATO activities, supporting Soviet diplomatic operations. But the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 had shaken Gordievsky's faith in the system he served. Watching Soviet tanks crush the Prague Spring reform movement, while KGB propagandists justified the invasion as liberation planted doubts that grew over subsequent years. By 1974, when MI6 approached Gordievsky in Copenhagen, his disillusionment was complete. British intelligence had identified him as a potential recruit, a KGB officer whose ideological commitment had weakened and who might be convinced to work against the Soviet system. The recruitment was handled with extraordinary care. MI6 didn't threaten or blackmail. They presented Gordievsky with a choice: continue serving a system he no longer believed in, or help the West understand Soviet operations so that genuine threats could be countered and unnecessary conflicts avoided. The appeal was to Gordievsky's conscience rather than his fear or greed. Gordievsky agreed to cooperate. For 11 years from 1974 to 1985, he operated as a double agent, outwardly a loyal KGB officer rising through the ranks while secretly providing British intelligence with information on KGB operations, Soviet diplomatic activities, and insights into Soviet leadership thinking. His posting to the Soviet embassy in London in 1982 gave him access to high-level KGB planning and allowed regular meetings with MI6 handlers. The intelligence he provided was extraordinary. Details of KGB operations against British targets, identities of Soviet agents in the West, analysis of Soviet leadership psychology that helped Western governments understand Moscow's decision-making processes. In 1985, KGB counterintelligence became suspicious. The exact source of suspicion remains unclear, possibly a leak from CIA officer Aldrich Ames, who was secretly working for the KGB, or possibly surveillance that detected anomalies in Gordievsky's behavior. Moscow recalled Gordievsky from London under pretext of promotion. Once he arrived in Moscow, KGB interrogators questioned him for weeks. The interrogation was brutal by Soviet standards: psychological pressure, isolation, accusations without evidence, demands for confession. But KGB counterintelligence couldn't prove betrayal. They had suspicions, but not definitive evidence that would justify arrest and trial. MI6 activated Operation Pimlico, a pre-arranged emergency extraction plan for agents whose cover had been compromised. Gordievsky escaped Moscow under dramatic circumstances, hidden in the trunk of a British diplomatic car that crossed into Finland. Soviet border guards searched the vehicle, but missed Gordievsky concealed in a specially modified compartment. Once in Finland, he was transferred to a British aircraft and flown to the United Kingdom. From London, CIA requested permission to debrief Gordievsky about his 11 years of access to KGB operations. He agreed and was transported to the United States for what would become one of the most comprehensive intelligence debriefings of the Cold War. The arrival at the Virginia safe house was Gordievsky's first exposure to American intelligence operations. MI6 had treated him professionally during the extraction and initial debriefing in London, but Gordievsky expected that CIA, the larger, more powerful American service, would employ harsher methods. The safe house appeared designed to lower his psychological defenses. 3 bedrooms, comfortable furniture, a kitchen with modern appliances. It looked like a suburban family home, because that's exactly what it was. A residence rented by CIA for debriefing operations that might extend for weeks or months. The CIA officer who greeted Gordievsky introduced himself as Michael, first name only, following protocol that protected American intelligence officers' identities, even from friendly defectors. Michael showed Gordievsky to a bedroom with a comfortable bed, closet with clothing in Gordievsky's size, and windows that looked onto a small yard. "Make yourself at home," Michael said. "We'll start debriefing tomorrow after you've had time to rest. The bathroom is down the hall. If you need anything during the night, there's an officer downstairs. Just ask." Gordievsky examined the room carefully, searching for hidden cameras or restraints that would be activated once he fell asleep. He found nothing. The bed was genuine. The windows had curtains and opened for fresh air, though he noticed officers outside maintaining security perimeter. He sat on the bed, testing the mattress. It was comfortable. For months in Moscow during KGB interrogation, he had slept on a narrow cot in a room with lights that never dimmed. The contrast was surreal. The first meal arrived 2 hours later. A cook employed by CIA brought steak, vegetables, potatoes, fresh bread, and asked if Gordievsky wanted wine with dinner. The food was real, hot, well-prepared, generous portions. Gordievsky ate slowly, waiting for the drugs he assumed were mixed in the food to take effect. Sodium pentothal, LSD, or other pharmacological agents that KGB training warned would be used to lower resistance. He finished the meal. No effects, no disorientation, no loss of control. The food was simply food. A doctor examined Gordievsky the following morning. The physician introduced himself, explained that this was a standard health assessment to ensure Gordievsky hadn't been injured during extraction or during the previous KGB interrogation in Moscow. The examination was professional, courteous, thorough. The doctor treated minor ailments, gave Gordievsky medication for stress-related digestive problems, recommended exercises for back pain from weeks of tense interrogation posture. Gordievsky had expected medical experiments, injection of drugs, psychological testing designed to break mental resistance. Instead, he received treatment indistinguishable from what any patient would receive from a competent physician concerned about their patient's well-being. Sleep became the next revelation. Gordievsky was shown to his bedroom at 10 p.m. and told that breakfast would be at 8 a.m. He could sleep as late as he needed. No one would disturb him during the night. The room had blackout curtains that blocked all light. The bed was comfortable. For the first time in months, Gordievsky slept 8 uninterrupted hours in darkness and silence. Soviet detention cells used bright lights 24 hours per day and noise designed to prevent deep sleep, standard sensory deprivation techniques that degraded prisoners' mental functioning. The American approach was opposite. Ensure the defector was healthy, rested, and capable of providing accurate information rather than breaking them down psychologically. The daily routine established during the first week set patterns that would continue throughout the debriefing. Morning breakfast with multiple options: eggs, pancakes, bacon, fresh fruit, juice, coffee. Gordievsky could eat what he wanted, as much as he wanted. Soviet detention food had been bread and watery soup with occasional thin gruel. The quality and quantity of American food was shocking. Afternoon debriefing sessions lasted 4 to 5 hours with breaks every hour. CIA officers asked questions, took notes, followed up on interesting points. Evening was free time. Gordievsky could watch television, read books that CIA provided in Russian and English, or walk in the yard under guard supervision for fresh air and exercise. The debriefing sessions themselves demolished every expectation Gordievsky had formed about Western interrogation. CIA officers were polite, professional, and patient. They asked questions about KGB structure, operations, personnel, and Soviet leadership. When Gordievsky answered, "I don't know," to questions outside his area of expertise, the officers accepted that answer and moved to different topics. No threats, no accusations, no demands that he must know the answer, and refusal to respond would result in punishment. The approach was collaborative rather than coercive. CIA officers treated Gordievsky as a colleague who possessed information they needed, rather than as an enemy who must be broken. Gordievsky's reaction during these first weeks was profound confusion, mixed with growing realization. "I kept waiting for the torture to begin," he would later write in his memoir. "I kept expecting the friendly officers to be replaced by interrogators with instruments of pain. I kept watching for the moment when the facade would drop and the reality that KGB training had promised would emerge. It never did. The humane treatment was real. The respect was genuine. Everything I had been taught about the West was a lie." The legal rights explanation came during the second week. A CIA officer, a woman named Sarah, who specialized in legal protocols, explained that Gordievsky had protections under international law. The Geneva Conventions applied even though Gordievsky wasn't a prisoner of war in traditional sense. He had the right to refuse to answer questions. He could request legal counsel if he felt his rights were being violated. He could appeal to international organizations if he believed he was being mistreated. The explanation was delivered matter-of-factly, as statement of policy rather than as propaganda designed to impress. Gordievsky struggled to process this information. Soviet intelligence training had never mentioned legal protections for captured agents. The concept that enemy intelligence services would voluntarily constrain themselves with legal frameworks seemed impossible. KGB doctrine held that capitalist nations claimed to follow laws, but violated them whenever convenient. The reality that CIA actually operated within legal constraints and explained those constraints to defectors contradicted fundamental assumptions about how intelligence operations worked. Communication with family became the next revelation. Gordievsky's wife and 2 daughters remained in Moscow, held by KGB as leverage to force his return or prevent him from cooperating with Western intelligence. Gordievsky expected that CIA would use his family as counter-leverage, threatening to abandon them to KGB punishment if he didn't provide complete cooperation. Instead, CIA officers explained that they understood his concern for his family and were working through diplomatic channels to negotiate their safe passage to the West. The process would take time, possibly years given Soviet resistance to admitting that a KGB colonel had defected, but CIA would continue pressing for their release. Sarah showed Gordievsky how to write letters that would be transmitted through Red Cross channels to his family. The letters would be read by KGB censors, so Gordievsky couldn't include intelligence information or criticism of the Soviet system. But he could let his wife know he was alive and safe, and that he was working to secure their exit from the Soviet Union. The ability to maintain some contact with family, even under KGB surveillance, was never mentioned in Soviet training about Western captivity. The training assumed that family would be used as tools for coercion, rather than as humanitarian concern that Western intelligence would address. The psychological approach CIA employed was fundamentally different from Soviet interrogation methodology. CIA officers treated Gordievsky as a professional colleague, an intelligence officer like themselves who happened to have served a different nation. "You're an intelligence professional," Michael explained during one session. "You understand operational security, source protection, the importance of accurate information. We respect your expertise. Tell us what you're comfortable sharing. We're not interested in breaking you. We're interested in understanding what you know, so we can protect our countries and our people." This approach, treating the defector as a professional equal rather than as an enemy to be destroyed, was revolutionary from Gordievsky's perspective. Soviet interrogation doctrine emphasized degradation and humiliation as techniques for breaking resistance. Prisoners were stripped of dignity, isolated from human contact, subjected to treatment designed to make them feel worthless. The goal was psychological destruction that would make them compliant. CIA's approach was opposite. Maintain the defector's dignity and self-respect, building relationship of mutual professional regard that encouraged voluntary cooperation. Food quality remained a constant reminder of the difference between Soviet and American treatment. 3 full meals daily with snacks available between meals. The safehouse cook prepared dishes tailored to Gordievsky's preferences. She asked what he liked, what foods reminded him of home, whether he had dietary restrictions. The meals included fresh vegetables, quality meat, desserts. Gordievsky gained 15 pounds during his first 2 months in American custody. He had arrived stressed and thin from months of KGB interrogation, where food was minimal and mealtimes irregular. The weight gain was visible proof of improved physical and mental health. Recreation and intellectual stimulation were provided without Gordievsky needing to ask. CIA officers brought books in Russian, literature, history, technical works on topics Gordievsky had expressed interest in during casual conversations. A television in the common room allowed Gordievsky to watch American news and entertainment programs. Exercise equipment was set up in the basement. The safe house yard, a quarter-acre of grass surrounded by trees, became a place where Gordievsky could walk under supervision, breathing fresh air and experiencing seasons changing as autumn progressed into winter. Soviet prisons operated under 23-hour lockdown protocols. Prisoners spent almost all time in cells without windows. Exercise was limited to brief periods in concrete yards. Reading material was restricted to approved Soviet literature that reinforced party doctrine. The contrast between Soviet detention and American defector handling couldn't have been more stark. One system was designed to break prisoners psychologically. The other was designed to maintain defector health and well-being while encouraging voluntary cooperation. Medical and dental care provided another area of profound contrast. Gordievsky received dental work to address problems that Soviet dentistry had either created or ignored, or new glasses were prescribed by an optometrist who conducted a thorough examination. A general physician monitored Gordievsky's overall health, providing medications for stress-related conditions and recommending lifestyle changes to improve recovery from the traumatic months in Moscow. CIA's concern for Gordievsky, his physical health, was genuine and comprehensive. They wanted him healthy and comfortable because healthy defectors provided better intelligence over longer periods than broken prisoners whose information quality degraded under physical and psychological stress. The human interaction Gordievsky experienced represented perhaps the most powerful demonstration of the difference between Soviet and American systems. CIA officers had meals with him, engaging in conversations about topics unrelated to intelligence, discussions about Russian literature, European history, American culture, family experiences. The conversations were genuine rather than manipulative. Officers treated Gordievsky as a guest rather than a prisoner. They asked about his opinions, shared their own perspectives, laughed at jokes, showed family photos. The normalcy of human interaction after months of isolation and hostile interrogation was emotionally overwhelming. The turning point came approximately 3 weeks into Gordievsky's debriefing. He had been treated with consistent humanity for long enough that he could no longer maintain the belief that this was elaborate psychological manipulation. The CIA's treatment was genuine. They actually operated according to the principles of human rights and legal protections they claimed to uphold. Everything KGB had taught about Western brutality was propaganda designed to keep Soviet officers loyal through fear of what would happen if they defected or were captured. Gordievsky made his decision. He would provide complete cooperation, everything he knew from 11 years as a double agent, with access to KGB operations at the highest levels. The information he could provide was extensive. KGB structure and personnel throughout Europe, Soviet intelligence operations against Western targets, agents the KGB had recruited in Western governments and institutions, Soviet leadership psychology based on his proximity to Politburo members during his time in Moscow, techniques KGB used for recruiting and managing agents, weaknesses in Soviet intelligence methodology that Western counterintelligence could exploit. The intelligence Gordievsky provided over subsequent months represented one of the greatest counterintelligence coups of the Cold War. He named Soviet agents operating in Western Europe, leading to their arrest or turning. He revealed KGB operations that could be disrupted or exploited. He explained Soviet intelligence priorities, allowing Western services to focus protective efforts on the most threatened areas. He provided insights into Soviet leadership thinking during critical periods, helping Western governments understand Moscow's decision-making during crises. The value of his cooperation extended far beyond the immediate intelligence. His defection forced KGB to assume that any operation he knew about was compromised, requiring extensive reorganization that disrupted Soviet intelligence for years. CIA officers expressed gratitude that Gordievsky found genuine rather than manipulative. "Your information is saving lives," Michael told him after a particularly productive debriefing session. "Our officers in the field are safer because we know which operations are compromised. Our governments can make better decisions because we understand Soviet thinking more clearly. What you're doing matters." The acknowledgement of his contribution's value provided satisfaction that Gordievsky hadn't anticipated. For years as a double agent, his work had been secret, recognized only by his MI6 handlers. Now, fighting the Soviet system openly, he could see the direct impact of his cooperation. The negotiation for his family's release became ongoing concern that CIA addressed seriously. Soviet authorities had denied that Gordievsky's wife and daughters could leave the USSR. The standard Soviet position held that family members of defectors were not hostages and had the right to remain in their homeland if they chose. The reality was that KGB denied exit visas and subjected family members to surveillance and pressure designed to force defectors' return. CIA continued diplomatic pressure through multiple channels, but progress was slow. The breakthrough came 6 years later, in 1991, during Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost reforms. Soviet restrictions on emigration had loosened as Gorbachev sought to improve USSR's international reputation and secure Western economic assistance. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher personally raised Gordievsky's case with Gorbachev during diplomatic negotiations. Gorbachev agreed to allow Gordievsky's wife and daughters to leave the Soviet Union. In September 1991, they were reunited in the United Kingdom. The family reunion after 6 years of separation was emotionally powerful and further validated Gordievsky's decision to cooperate fully with Western intelligence. Gordievsky became a British citizen, reflecting his initial recruitment by MI6 and his residence in the UK after extraction. In 2007, he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II in recognition of his services to British security. He continued consulting for Western intelligence services, sharing expertise on Russian intelligence operations that remained relevant decades after his defection. He wrote books exposing KGB operations, gave interviews about his experiences, and became a public figure whose story illustrated the human dimension of Cold War intelligence operations. He lived in the United Kingdom until his death in 2024 at age 85. His legacy extended beyond the immediate intelligence he provided during debriefing. Gordievsky's defection and subsequent public advocacy undermined Soviet intelligence credibility. His writings exposed KGB operations in detail that Soviet propaganda couldn't effectively counter. His collaboration with Western intelligence throughout decades after his defection provided institutional knowledge that informed counterintelligence operations against Russian services long after the Soviet Union collapsed. His life story became proof that Soviet officers who chose the West received treatment that honored their decision and protected their humanity. The pattern Gordievsky experienced wasn't unique. Other Soviet defectors reported similar experiences when they came under American or British control. Arkady Shevchenko, a senior Soviet diplomat at the United Nations who defected to the United States in 1978, later wrote, "I expected torture based on what Soviet training had taught. What I received was therapy, psychological support to help me adjust to new life while providing information voluntarily." Viktor Belenko, the MiG-25 pilot who defected to Japan in 1976 and was debriefed by CIA, reported, "CIA officers treated me better than Soviet Air Force had treated me as a pilot. The respect and care were genuine." The contrast with Soviet treatment of captured Western agents was stark and deliberate. Oleg Penkovsky, a GRU officer who spied for CIA and British intelligence from 1960 to 1962, was arrested by KGB counterintelligence after a Soviet double agent betrayed him. Penkovsky was tortured during interrogation, beaten, subjected to sleep deprivation, threatened with execution of his family. He was tried publicly in a propaganda show trial, convicted of treason, and executed in 1963. The brutality of his treatment was publicized by Soviet authorities as warning to other potential defectors. The message was clear: betray the Soviet Union, and you'll die in agony. The fundamental difference between Soviet and Western intelligence operations reflected deeper ideological contrasts. Soviet intelligence operated in a system built on fear, where even loyal officers couldn't fully trust the regime they served. KGB officers knew that any hint of disloyalty would result in imprisonment, torture, and likely execution. Families of accused traitors were punished. The entire structure operated on coercion and terror as controlling mechanisms. American and British intelligence operated in systems that valued human rights, even for enemy agents. Geneva Convention's protections were real constraints, not propaganda to be ignored when convenient. Legal frameworks that protected prisoners' rights were enforced by institutional oversight that punished violations. The treatment defectors received wasn't cynical manipulation. It was consistent application of principles that Western democracies claim to uphold. And that consistency was more powerful than any psychological operation could have been. The intelligence value of humane treatment proved superior to coercion in measurable ways. Defectors who were treated well provided more accurate information over longer periods. Cooperative sources who felt respected were more willing to clarify uncertainties, correct misunderstandings, and volunteer additional information they hadn't been directly asked about. Tortured prisoners said whatever interrogators wanted to hear to make pain stop, producing intelligence that was unreliable and often completely false. The quality difference between information gained through cooperation versus coercion was so significant that CIA and MI6 doctrine formally rejected torture not just as morally wrong, but as operationally counterproductive. The psychological warfare dimension of humane treatment extended beyond individual defectors. Every Soviet intelligence officer who defected and received respectful treatment became a propaganda victory that undermined Soviet narratives about Western brutality. Stories circulated through Soviet intelligence communities about agents who chose the West and found not torture, but dignity. The effect was cumulative. Each defector made the next defection slightly easier to contemplate because Soviet officers knew that Western treatment was humane rather than brutal. The Cold War intelligence struggle was fought on multiple levels. Technology mattered. Satellite reconnaissance, electronic surveillance, signal intercepts, tradecraft mattered, dead drops, brush passes, covert communications. But the human dimension mattered most. Which side could recruit the other's officers? Which side could protect its own agents? Which side could turn enemy agents into cooperative sources? On these questions, Western intelligence services held decisive advantages rooted not in superior technology, but in superior treatment of human beings. KGB had trained its officers to expect Western torture, beatings, drugs, psychological breakdown techniques that would destroy their minds while extracting their secrets. Oleg Gordievsky found coffee served in comfortable surroundings, medical care that addressed his health needs, and respect from officers who treated him as professional colleague rather than as enemy to be destroyed. The gap between expectation and reality shocked him profoundly, and that shock became the foundation for cooperation that devastated Soviet intelligence operations throughout Europe. The technology gap that mattered most in this story wasn't radar or missiles or aircraft. It was social technology, systems for treating human beings that either valued their dignity or crushed it. Soviet methods built on fear and torture created officers who defected when opportunity arose. Western methods built on human rights and legal protections created an environment where defectors became allies who cooperated voluntarily and completely. In the end, humane treatment turned enemy agents into intelligence assets more effectively than any torture technique ever could. And that lesson, learned by Oleg Gordievsky in a Virginia safe house in 1985, illustrated why the Cold War's outcome was never really in doubt.